Have you ever felt like something was watching you when you were alone? That prickling sensation on the back of your neck. The feeling that you're not as alone as you think. Evelyn Sinclair never believed in the supernatural until she bought the porcelain doll. It wasn't just any antique. It was exquisite, almost too perfect, with deep, glassy eyes that seemed to follow her every move. At first, she thought it was just a trick of the mind, but soon, things began to change. The air in her house became heavy, suffocating, and shadows seemed to stretch a little too long, lingering just out of sight. That was only the beginning. One evening, she returned home from the auction, thrilled with her new purchase. She placed the doll on her mantel, admiring its fine craftsmanship, the delicate painted face, the tiny silk dress. But as she turned away, she swore she heard something, a faint, almost imperceptible whisper. The sound was soft, barely audible, like a voice carried by the wind. She dismissed it, laughing at her own paranoia. Yet that night, she couldn't shake the eerie feeling that the doll was watching her, even when she wasn't in the room. A heavy silence filled the house, as if something was waiting. Evelyn had always loved collecting antiques, objects with history, with stories behind them. But this doll felt different, its presence unsettling, almost malevolent. The longer she kept it in her home, the more the air around her seemed to change. Rooms that once felt safe now carried an oppressive weight, and every creak in the floorboards sent a shiver down her spine. What started as fascination quickly turned into dread, but she couldn't get rid of it, not yet. There was something about the doll that called to her, a dark, unspoken history hidden beneath the porcelain surface. What secrets did it hold? What horrors had it witnessed? As Evelyn's life began to unravel, so did her sense of reality. The line between what was real and what was imagined blurred with each passing day. Had she made a mistake? Had she brought something far more dangerous into her home? The doll's glass eyes seemed to shimmer with dark intent, watching, waiting for the perfect moment to strike. Could you live with something like that? Don't forget to subscribe and hit the like button, because Evelyn's nightmare has only just begun, and it might be closer to your reality than you think. That night, as the moonlight filtered weakly through her bedroom window, Evelyn drifted into an uneasy sleep. Her dreams were vivid, almost too real, pulling her into a world she didn't recognize, yet felt disturbingly familiar. She found herself standing in a dimly lit room, the smell of decay thick in the air. The walls were covered in peeling wallpaper, once vibrant, but now dulled by time and neglect. A faint, rhythmic creaking echoed through the house, as though the very structure was breathing. In the corner of the room, barely illuminated by the flickering light of a single, dying candle, sat the porcelain doll. Its cold, glassy eyes locked onto hers, unblinking. The silence was suffocating, broken only by the sound of Evelyn's shallow breaths. She could feel the temperature drop, a cold chill crawling up her spine. The doll was no longer just an object. It was watching her, studying her. She tried to move, but her feet felt glued to the floor, as if the house itself was holding her in place. The air grew thick with the scent of mold, and something else, something metallic and sharp, like blood. Suddenly, the faintest whisper filled the room, coming from the direction of the doll. The words were indecipherable, but they carried a weight that pressed down on her chest, making it harder to breathe. Evelyn's pulse quickened as the whispering grew louder, forming words she still couldn't understand, but the tone was unmistakable, threatening, malicious. She tried to wake up, but the dream refused to release her. The doll's tiny porcelain hands moved, ever so slightly, as if trying to reach out to her. Panic surged through Evelyn as she realized this wasn't just a dream. It was something more. She had never felt such an overwhelming sense of dread before, as though the very essence of fear had wrapped itself around her. Suddenly, the candle extinguished itself with a soft hiss, plunging the room into total darkness. The whispering ceased, replaced by an eerie silence. But the darkness wasn't empty. Evelyn could feel a presence looming near her, cold and sinister, as if the doll's spirit had left its body and was now hovering inches from her face. Her heart pounded in her chest, each beat louder than the last, as the air thickened with malevolence. In the pitch black, she could hear it, the faint, deliberate sound of something moving closer, something that should not exist. She screamed, but no sound came out. The darkness swallowed her whole. Evelyn jolted awake, drenched in sweat, her breath coming in ragged gasps. The room was quiet, the moonlight soft and pale, but her heart still raced with the terror of the dream. She glanced over at the shelf where the doll sat, motionless, its lifeless eyes staring straight at her bed. It hadn't moved, or had it? Was the dream just her imagination playing tricks on her, or was it something far worse? The oppressive feeling lingered, a shadow of the dream that refused to fade. She was no longer sure where the nightmare ended and reality began. What was the doll hiding? What did it want from her? Over the next few days, the boundaries between reality and nightmare blurred even further. Evelyn couldn't shake the lingering sense of dread that hung over her, following her like a shadow. It started with small, almost imperceptible changes. The doll, once securely perched on her mantel, would appear in different places around the house. At first, she thought it was just her own forgetfulness. She would place it back, only to find it move again the next day, sitting in a chair, standing by a window, or even at the foot of her bed. The rational part of her mind tried to dismiss it, but the unease gnawed at her, refusing to let go. One evening, as she sat in her living room, the familiar whisper returned. This time, it was louder, clearer, as though it were right behind her. Evelyn froze, her heart pounding in her chest, but when she turned, no one was there. The doll sat in its place, motionless, yet the air felt thick with something unseen, something watching. The whispers became a nightly occurrence, always just on the edge of her hearing, never loud enough to fully understand, but their malevolent tone was unmistakable. It felt as if the doll was trying to communicate, to lure her deeper into its twisted grasp. As the tension escalated, Evelyn began hearing things she couldn't explain. The floors creaked under the weight of invisible footsteps. Doors would open and close on their own, carried by a wind that didn't exist. The house felt alive, pulsing with a sinister energy that seemed to revolve around the doll. One night, as she lay in bed, trying to calm her racing mind, she heard a soft thud from downstairs. She bolted upright, straining to listen. The sound came again, this time closer, as if something, or someone, was moving through the house. Slowly, deliberately, the whispers followed, now accompanied by faint, childlike giggles, echoing through the dark. Evelyn's pulse quickened as fear gripped her tightly. She grabbed her phone, shining its weak light into the hallway, but it did nothing to dispel the oppressive darkness. Gathering her courage, she descended the stairs, the old wooden steps creaking beneath her weight. The house was deathly still, except for the faint, rhythmic ticking of the antique clock on the wall. But there, in the middle of the room, was the doll, its glassy eyes gleaming in the dim light, as if waiting for her. A chill ran down her spine as she realized something was horribly wrong. The doll had moved again, this time without her ever touching it. As Evelyn stood frozen, the giggling returned, louder now, echoing around her in a disorienting cacophony. It seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere all at once. The air grew colder, and a palpable sense of dread settled over her like a suffocating blanket. The doll's face, once expressionless, now seemed to twist, just slightly, as if its porcelain features were coming to life, warping into something grotesque. Evelyn backed away, her hands trembling, but the room itself felt like it was closing in, shrinking around her. She stumbled, catching herself on the doorframe, her breath coming in ragged gasps. Then, without warning, the giggling stopped, replaced by a single, chilling whisper. "We're not alone." Evelyn's blood ran cold. She turned sharply, convinced someone else was there with her, but the room was empty. Yet the feeling of being watched was stronger than ever. Panic surged through her as she fled back upstairs, slamming the door behind her. But as she collapsed onto her bed, the whispers continued, now from within the room itself. And this time, They weren't alone. That night, the whispers returned, but they were no longer just faint murmurs. They were voices, clear, distinct, and coming from all directions. As Evelyn lay in bed, frozen in fear, she heard the unmistakable sound of footsteps creeping up the stairs. They were slow, deliberate, as if whoever, or whatever, it was wanted her to know it was coming. The air in the room grew colder with each step, and a thick fog seemed to creep in from the hallway, swirling at the edges of her vision. The doll, now sitting on her dresser, stared at her with those cold, glassy eyes. But something had changed. The doll's mouth, once frozen in a neutral expression, now seemed to curl into a subtle, sinister smile. Evelyn's heart pounded in her chest as the door to her bedroom creaked open on its own. The footsteps stopped. Silence. But the presence, that horrible, suffocating presence, was there with her. It hung in the air like a dark cloud, pressing down on her. She tried to scream, but no sound came out. Her body refused to move, as if she were paralyzed, trapped in a waking nightmare. The doll's smile grew wider, its porcelain features contorting in a way that no inanimate object should be able to. And then, the whispering began again, louder now, more insistent. "You can't run," it hissed. "You belong to us." Suddenly, the lights in the room flickered and went out, plunging Evelyn into complete darkness. Her breath came in ragged gasps as she fumbled for her phone, but when she turned on the flashlight, the doll was no longer on the dresser. Panic surged through her veins as she whipped the light around the room, searching for it. And then she saw it, at the foot of her bed, standing upright, its lifeless eyes fixed on her. But now, there was something more. Its tiny porcelain hands were outstretched, reaching for her. Without thinking, Evelyn threw the blankets aside and bolted for the door, her feet barely touching the ground as she ran down the stairs. But as she reached the living room, she stopped dead in her tracks. The doll was there, sitting on the couch, waiting for her. The whispers filled the air, now overlapping in a chorus of sinister voices, chanting in a language she didn't understand. The room began to spin, and Evelyn could feel her grip on reality slipping away. Was this still a dream, or had the doll's dark power pulled her into something far worse? Desperately, she grabbed the doll and ran to the basement, the one place she had avoided since the strange events began. She had no other choice. With shaking hands, she threw the doll into a large wooden chest and slammed the lid shut. For a moment, the house fell eerily silent. But then, from within the chest, she heard it, a soft, insidious laugh, followed by a single word whispered in the dark. "Soon." Gasping for air, Evelyn stumbled backward, her hands trembling uncontrollably. The doll's laughter echoed in her mind, louder and louder, until it felt like her skull was splitting apart. She had to end this. She couldn't live like this anymore. But as she reached for the key to lock the chest, the whispers returned, this time from the basement walls themselves. The truth hit her like a cold wave. The doll wasn't just an object. It was a vessel for something far older, far darker, and far more dangerous than she could ever have imagined. In that moment, the basement lights flickered, casting long, distorted shadows across the room. And as the final light bulb burst, plunging her into total darkness, Evelyn realized the horrifying truth. The doll wasn't locked away. It was free, and it wasn't done with her yet. Evelyn awoke the next morning drenched in sweat, her heart still racing from the horrors of the night before. She wanted to believe it was all a nightmare, just a trick of the mind, but deep down, she knew the truth. The doll was not just an antique. It was something far worse, something beyond explanation. Determined to rid herself of the creeping dread that had taken over her life, Evelyn began investigating the doll's origins. The auction had listed it as a 19th century piece, but there was something ancient about it, something that made her feel like the doll carried a dark history that no catalog could capture. She combed through old records, newspapers, anything she could find about the auction house where she had bought the doll. The further she dug, the more disturbing the connections became. The doll had once belonged to a little girl named Annabelle Morton, who mysteriously disappeared in the late 1800s. Her parents had been found dead in their home, their faces frozen in expressions of sheer terror, with no signs of struggle. But the doll, the doll asterisk, had been found sitting between them, its glassy eyes wide open, staring into the void. Locals whispered that it was cursed, but the truth had been buried in the pages of forgotten history. No one had connected the doll to the family's tragic fate until now. Evelyn's hands trembled as she found an old photograph of Annabelle's family, her breath catching in her throat when she saw the image. There, in the center of the photo, was the same porcelain doll, unchanged by time. Its eyes gleamed even in the faded black and white picture, just as they did in her living room. It hadn't aged, hadn't deteriorated, almost as if it were preserved by something far more sinister than craftsmanship. The connection between the doll and the tragedy was undeniable, but what haunted Evelyn the most was the realization that the nightmare was repeating itself. The doll had found a new host, and this time, it was her. But what pushed Evelyn deeper into panic was a chilling discovery she had never expected. As she continued to search, she found a journal belonging to Annabelle's mother. The entries described the strange occurrences that had plagued her family after acquiring the doll, exactly like what Evelyn had been experiencing. Whispers in the night, objects moving on their own, and dreams that felt too real to be mere figments of the imagination. The final entry in the journal sent a shiver down her spine. Asterisk. It wants a soul. It will not stop until it has one. As the words sank in, Evelyn realized that this wasn't just a cursed object. The doll had been searching, waiting for the right person to come along. It had been dormant, its power growing over time, and now it had latched on to her. The whispers, the movements, the dreams, they were all part of its twisted game. And the worst part, it was no longer confined to her dreams. The doll's malevolent force had seeped into her reality, poisoning her thoughts, making her doubt her own sanity. The haunting wasn't just in her house, it was inside her mind. Desperate for answers, Evelyn began retracing her steps, trying to find a way to sever the connection between herself and the doll. But as she pieced together the puzzle, one horrifying truth became clear. The doll wasn't just after her. It had already started taking her. Every night, it crept deeper into her soul, inching closer to its final goal. And now, she was running out of time. The whispers weren't just in her dreams anymore. They followed her everywhere, relentless and unyielding, growing louder with each passing day. It was as if the doll was taunting her, reminding her that there was no escape. In her frantic search, Evelyn stumbled across an obscure article from the early 1900s that offered a sliver of hope. There was a ritual, a way to banish the entity within the doll, but it required a dangerous, near impossible task, confronting the spirit in its own realm, the twisted nightmare world it had created. It was her only chance. Yet, as the shadows around her deepened, and the doll's presence grew more oppressive, Evelyn couldn't shake the feeling that this was exactly what the doll wanted. Was she playing into its hands, or was this her only shot at salvation? With trembling hands, she prepared for the ritual, knowing that the line between the dream world and reality was fading fast. Every passing moment brought her closer to the doll's dark clutches, and now she had to face the unimaginable truth. The nightmare was no longer just a figment of her imagination. It was her life, and the doll wouldn't stop until it had consumed her entirely. Evelyn's days became a blur of paranoia and dread. Every shadow in her home seemed to stretch with malicious intent, and every creak in the floorboards sent icy chills down her spine. The doll's presence had become unbearable, an oppressive force that filled the air with a suffocating weight. Her once peaceful home was now a prison, and the sense of being watched never left her. It was as though the walls themselves were alive, pulsing with the dark energy that radiated from the porcelain figure. Sleep was no longer a refuge. It was where the terror thrived. The dreams had intensified, their horrific imagery bleeding into her waking life. She wasn't sure what was real anymore. Desperate to find answers and rid herself of the doll's curse, Evelyn began seeking help. She reached out to local historians, paranormal researchers, anyone who might have a shred of knowledge about the malevolent force that had taken hold of her life. Most dismissed her as paranoid, a woman too deep into her own obsession with antiques. But there was one person who listened, a reclusive occult expert named Father Callahan, a man with a dark past of his own. His voice was weathered, and his eyes betrayed years of knowledge about things that most people preferred to forget. "This isn't just a curse," he warned. "It's a possession. The doll isn't what it seems. It's a vessel." Father Callahan revealed that the doll had been used in rituals dating back centuries, its porcelain shell a prison for something far older and far more dangerous. The whispers Evelyn had heard were not the doll's. They were the voices of those it had claimed. Their souls, trapped in the liminal space between life and death, spoke through the doll, warning her of the fate that awaited if she didn't act quickly. But it wasn't just their souls trapped inside the doll. There was something darker, something ancient, feeding on their despair. "It's a parasite," Callahan explained grimly. "It attaches itself to the vulnerable. Those it senses can be broken. And once it has you, it won't stop until it consumes everything." With this revelation, Evelyn's fear deepened into something far worse: hopelessness. She wasn't just battling an object. She was fighting an ancient evil that had already begun to feed on her soul. But Callahan wasn't finished. He explained that there was a ritual, one that could sever the doll's hold on her, but it was dangerous, and the odds of survival were slim. It required confronting the doll on its terms, entering the dream world where it held the most power, and destroying the link between it and this world. "But be warned," he said, his voice low and grave. "It will fight back, and it will know your deepest fears." Despite the overwhelming terror, Evelyn knew she had no other choice. The doll was slowly eroding her mind, its influence growing stronger with each passing day. Every night the whispers became clearer, more demanding. They weren't just background noise anymore. They were calling her by name, begging her to give in, to let go. She had to act before the doll consumed her completely. But as she prepared for the ritual, gathering the sacred symbols and objects Callahan had instructed her to use, the whispers became screams. The doll, which had once been content to merely haunt her, was now actively tormenting her. One night, as Evelyn was preparing the final steps for the ritual, she heard the sound of footsteps behind her. They were unmistakably heavy, not the delicate tap of porcelain, but the thudding of something larger, more menacing. When she turned, the doll was not where she had left it. Instead, it stood in the center of the room, its eyes gleaming in the dim light. But it wasn't alone. The air was thick with shadows, swirling around the doll, coalescing into the vague shapes of people who weren't there, but whose presence was undeniable. The spirits trapped inside the doll had manifested, their faces twisted in silent agony. The room felt like it was closing in on her, the walls bending and warping, distorting her perception of reality. Evelyn could hear the voices of the spirits, not just in her mind, but all around her, echoing off the walls, begging her to free them, to end their suffering. But mixed with their pleas was the voice of the entity itself, dark and seductive, promising her release if she simply gave in. "You're tired, Evelyn," it whispered. "Let me take the burden. It will all be over soon." Her hands trembled as she clutched the ritual objects, knowing that the entity was trying to break her resolve. The line between the living world and the spirit world was blurring, and she was standing on the edge of the abyss. As Evelyn stood there, face to face with the doll and the spirits it had enslaved, she felt a crushing weight on her chest. The darkness was suffocating, wrapping around her like tendrils, pulling her deeper into despair. She was terrified, more than she had ever been in her life, but she couldn't turn back now. The ritual was her only hope. With a shaking voice, she began to recite the incantations Father Callahan had taught her, her words barely audible over the deafening whispers of the trapped souls. But as the ritual progressed, the room began to shake, and the doll's smile grew wider, as if it knew something she didn't. Evelyn could feel the entity's anger rising, and with it, the terrifying realization that it was not going to let her go without a fight. As Evelyn plunged deeper into the ritual, the air around her seemed to thicken, growing dense with a malevolent force that pressed down on her chest like invisible hands. The candles flickered wildly, casting long, distorted shadows on the walls that seemed to dance with sinister intent. The doll, once motionless, now stood upright in the center of the room, its lifeless porcelain face twisted into a grotesque mockery of a smile. Its eyes gleamed with an unnatural light, as if the entity trapped within was awakening fully, ready to strike. The temperature in the room plummeted, and Evelyn's breath came out in misty puffs, the cold biting into her skin like icy claws. As she recited the final words of the ritual, a loud, deafening crack reverberated through the room, as if the very fabric of reality was being torn apart. The doll's porcelain skin began to fracture, hairline cracks spidering across its surface. But instead of relief, a wave of pure terror washed over Evelyn. The doll wasn't breaking, it was transforming. From within the cracks, a thick, black smoke began to seep out, swirling around the room like a living thing. The entity was no longer confined to the doll. It had been set free. The smoke coalesced into a figure, tall and shadowy, its form barely distinguishable but undeniably malevolent. Its eyes glowed a deep crimson, burning with an ancient, otherworldly rage. It towered over Evelyn, filling the room with its dark presence. The whispers from the spirits trapped within the doll turned into screams, their torture voices pleading for mercy, for release. But the entity's voice overpowered them, a guttural, inhuman growl that shook the very foundation of the house. "You thought you could escape me," it hissed, its voice reverberating through the air like the echo of a nightmare. "You are mine, now and forever." Evelyn's heart raced as she realized the horrifying truth. The ritual hadn't banished the entity. It had only made it stronger. It was no longer bound to the doll, no longer trapped in its porcelain prison. Now it was free, and it wanted her. Her mind reeled as the weight of the situation crashed down on her. She had unknowingly unleashed the very thing she had been trying to rid herself of, and now it was stronger than ever. The entity lunged toward her, its shadowy form enveloping her in darkness. Evelyn screamed, but no sound came out, her voice swallowed by the thick, oppressive air. Desperate, she scrambled backward, trying to escape its reach. But the room seemed to stretch endlessly, as though reality itself was warping around her. The walls twisted and buckled, and the floor beneath her feet became unstable, as if the house was slowly being consumed by the entity's dark power. Her vision blurred, and her body felt heavy, weighed down by an invisible force. The voices of the spirits filled her head, their cries of anguish mingling with the entity's chilling laughter. She was trapped in its web, and there was no escape. The entity spoke again, its voice a venomous whisper that sent shivers down her spine. "You were chosen, Evelyn, just like the others. You are the key to my return." As it spoke, memories flooded her mind, flashes of her childhood, moments she had long forgotten. She saw herself as a little girl, playing with an old doll she didn't remember owning, and the pieces fell into place. The doll had been part of her life before, buried in the recesses of her mind, forgotten until now. This wasn't just an antique she had purchased. It had been waiting for her, calling to her all along. The realization hit her like a punch to the gut. She wasn't just a victim of circumstance. She was connected to this entity, to this curse. It had been stalking her since childhood, weaving itself into the fabric of her life, waiting for the moment when it could take her completely. Her entire existence had been a series of events leading up to this moment. The doll, the dreams, the whispers, they were all part of its plan to claim her soul. With a surge of desperation, Evelyn grabbed the ritual dagger she had prepared earlier, her hands shaking as she faced the entity. She knew the odds were against her, but she had no other choice. If she didn't fight, her soul would be devoured, and the entity would escape into the world. As the entity loomed over her, its shadowy form writhing and shifting, Evelyn plunged the dagger into the floor, completing the final part of the ritual. A blinding light erupted from the point of contact, and the entity let out a roar of fury, its form flickering and distorting as the light enveloped it. For a moment, everything was still. The entity writhed in agony, its shadowy form breaking apart, dissipating into the air. But just as Evelyn began to hope that she had won, the entity's voice echoed one last time, soft and chilling. "This isn't over. You can never escape me." And with that, it vanished, leaving behind only the shattered remains of the porcelain doll, lying in pieces on the floor. Evelyn collapsed, her body trembling from exhaustion and fear. The house was silent once more, but the weight of what had happened lingered in the air. She had survived, but at what cost? The entity was gone, for now, but its final words echoed in her mind, a constant reminder that this was far from over. The doll may have been destroyed, but the curse remained. And somewhere, in the shadows, it was waiting, watching, for the right moment to return. The days that followed were eerily quiet, but the silence only deepened Evelyn's sense of unease. The shattered pieces of the porcelain doll had been swept away, but the feeling of being watched, that ever-present weight, remained. The house, once her sanctuary, felt like a hollow shell, its walls steeped in the dark energy that had lingered for too long. Every creak in the floorboards, every flicker of light, sent shivers down her spine, as if the entity was still lurking in the shadows, waiting for the right moment to return. The tension in the air was thick, suffocating, and Evelyn could no longer trust her own senses. She wasn't sure if she was truly free, or if this was just a temporary reprieve. Though the doll was gone, strange things continued to happen. At night, Evelyn still heard faint whispers, so soft they could almost be mistaken for the wind, but she knew better. The voices, though distant, were familiar. They were the same spirits she had heard before, their cries for help now faint, but still there, as if they were trapped somewhere between this world and the next. And then there were the dreams. She thought they would stop after the ritual, but they hadn't. Each night, Evelyn found herself back in that decaying house, standing in front of the doll. Only now, the doll was no longer broken. It was whole, its lifeless eyes staring up at her, a silent reminder of what she had unleashed. One evening, while sorting through old papers, Evelyn stumbled upon a document she hadn't seen before. It was an old letter, yellowed with age, written by someone who had owned the doll long before her. The letter spoke of strange occurrences, of dreams and whispers, of the doll moving on its own. But what chilled her to the bone was the final sentence. Asterisk. It always comes back. It doesn't matter how far you run or how hard you fight, it will find you again. Asterisk. A cold dread settled over her as she realized the truth. The doll, or rather, the entity inside it, had been passed from one victim to the next for centuries, and now it was her turn to carry the curse. Despite the ritual, despite everything she had done to rid herself of the doll's dark influence, Evelyn knew that it was far from over. The entity wasn't gone. It was just waiting, watching. It had retreated into the shadows, biding its time, but would come back, just as it always had. And when it did, it would be stronger, more relentless. The realization gnawed at her, keeping her awake at night, her mind racing with the possibilities. How long did she have? A few days? A few weeks? Or was it already too late? She had no way of knowing, and that was the true horror of it all. The uncertainty, the waiting, the not knowing when the nightmare would begin again. And then, one night, as she was preparing for bed, she noticed something out of place. A faint, childlike giggle echoed through the hallways. Her blood ran cold as she slowly turned, her eyes scanning the room. On her dresser, where there had been nothing just moments before, sat a single shard of porcelain. It was small, barely noticeable, but unmistakable. A piece of the doll. Her heart pounded in her chest as she approached it, dread rising with each step. The air grew thick with a familiar, oppressive energy, and in that moment, she knew. Asterisk, it was Backstar. The entity had never truly left. It had been watching, waiting for her to let her guard down. And now, the game was starting all over again. Evelyn's mind raced. Had she ever really escaped? Was the entity playing a longer, more insidious game than she had realized? She felt the darkness creeping in around her once more, the whispers growing louder, their tone more menacing. The sense of impending doom washed over her, and she realized with horrifying clarity that this cycle would never end. The entity wasn't after her soul alone. It was feeding on her fear, drawing strength from her despair. The doll was just the beginning. What came next would be far worse. As she stared at the shard of porcelain, the lights flickered, and the whispers grew deafening. The entity's voice cut through the cacophony, cold and unforgiving. "You didn't think it would be that easy, did you?" Evelyn's breath caught in her throat. The ritual hadn't saved her. It had only delayed the inevitable. And now it was too late. She had let the darkness in, and there was no escaping it. Not this time. What would you do if you were in Evelyn's shoes? Could you fight something that doesn't die? Something that lives off your deepest fears? Or would you surrender, knowing that no matter how hard you fight, it will always come back? Leave your theories in the comments below, and let us know what you think Evelyn should do next. Should she run, or should she face the entity head-on, knowing that the odds are against her? And don't forget to like, share, and subscribe if you want more terrifying stories like this one. Because sometimes, the scariest part of a nightmare isn't waking up. It's realizing that it never really ends.